is Jeffrey Lin, and my topic was over phishing, password vulnerabilities, and cybersecurity. So why these concepts specifically? Well, as for cybersecurity has always been something that I've been interested in. And so last year our student passwords were changed out for newer and supposedly more secure passwords. I began to wonder whether or not these newer passwords were actually more secure than our previous student passwords. As for why I was interested in phishing, there were two main articles that caught my attention. The first article was written by Mazzuccoli, who found that the cost of damage that cybersecurity has caused has increased continuously by a rate of 15% each year. Another study done by another Lin, has found that most of this can be attributed to phishing attacks. So now with all these together, that comes to the research question of how can we prevent these phishing vulnerabilities that exist through student passwords in high schools. So I've been talking a lot about phishing vulnerabilities, but I haven't really defined what they are. So in order to define what a phishing vulnerability is, I'm going to break it down to two different words: phishing and vulnerability. So a phishing attack is basically just a social engineering attack which means that it uses it tricks the user to reveal the confidential information. What makes phishing unique to other social engineering attacks is that phishing attacks usually accomplish this through email attacks, along with the use of a cybersecurity attack known as cross-site scripting, which is basically just another way to say malicious links. Now, a vulnerability is just a weakness, and in cybersecurity, it is also known as an attack vector. And so when I say the words attack vector throughout this slide, it just means a vulnerability. When we combine these two words, phishing and vulnerability, we just get a place in the system that can be easily attacked by a phishing attack. So how does this relate to password security? Well, to understand that, first we must understand the concept of privilege escalation. What privilege escalation is it basically just is what it sounds like. A privilege escalation attack is a cybersecurity attack based on escalating the privileges of the cybercriminal that is attacking. This is mostly accomplished through obtaining a system with low level privileges in order to gain a system with higher level privileges, trust, and then tricking them to compromise that level of privilege and then keep repeating the process. How this could work in school systems is that a cybercriminal can first compromise a student email through any means or any methods, and then use that student email to trick a teacher's account through a phishing attack to compromise their account, and then use the same thing to repeat against an admin to compromise their account, and then this process can repeat over and over again until a level of privilege is reached that is desirable for the cybercriminal. So privilege escalation attacks are pretty dangerous. So how do we prevent them? Well, pre-existing research has defined two different ways to defend against privilege escalation attacks. The first being reducing privileges on all levels. This can include limiting what words can the email contain, limiting what links can be provided in emails, and limiting certain attachments that emails can contain amongst all users of the platform. While this is pretty effective at preventing phishing attacks, it becomes really hard to implement as we go up higher levels, especially in school systems where, especially the admins who need to communicate with the local government and different people. They need to have access to using links and all this other stuff that we will be limiting if we choose this method. However, the second method that pre-existing research has found is that we can make stronger passwords. Now, not only is this very easy to implement on all levels, it is very effective because it stops the privilege escalation attacks at its root. And the way it does this is because in order for a privilege escalation attack to succeed, as shown in the previous slide, a cybercriminal must compromise an account with a low privilege first, which is usually done by compromising the password. So when we make these passwords stronger, it makes it harder for cybercriminals to get in and access an account in the first place, which stops the problem of privilege escalation attacks. Now, the only con I can see to this is that stronger passwords are harder to remember, but that shouldn't be too big of a deal. So since this is our best option, this is the method that we are going to use and we're going to explore to prevent privilege escalation attacks. Now, in order to implement this in schools, we must first understand what the student password systems in schools are. This is because when I say that we are making stronger passwords, I am first assuming that the passwords in schools aren't secure in the first place. So, in order to decide whether or not they are secure, you must understand what they are. So schools and password systems in schools are mainly follow a simple format that is decided by an admin from typically the IT department of the school, and then distributed amongst all the students and staff. So some examples of student password formats include using student ID numbers, using the date of birth along with ID numbers, and probably the most important format that we're going to discuss today, which is using a simple set of letters along with a symbol somewhere between those letters. Now, disclaimer, none of these passwords are real, and if they were, then they were not intentional. So now that we know what school passwords are, we have to know whether or not they are secure. So there have been two different sides of this argument found so far on whether or not school passwords are secure, and this is kind of where the gap comes in. So the first side of the argument presented by Bush and Bruman argues that the passwords generated from the admins are much more secure because these passwords that are from the admin are much more memorable because they use memorable formats, and memorability increases security of passwords because complex passwords are hard to remember, and if a user cannot remember the password, they'll typically write it down somewhere which can be found, and then which in turn removes the point of having a complex password in the first place. Bush and Bruman also bases this idea on the fact that people are just typically not good at remembering memorable passwords. However, on the flip side of the argument, we have the argument presented by Merv Yildirim. She claims that passwords generated from employees, or in this case, the students, are much more secure. This is because these passwords can contain a higher variety of what's inside the password, such as numbers, symbols, and letters, which can make it harder for cyber criminals to compromise a password. This is because if all passwords were to follow one format, and the cyber criminal discovers that format, they can use that to easily attack and compromise more systems because of the increased number of attack vectors. She also argues that although people may be bad at remembering stuff, password memorability can be increased by guidance and encouragement. So since this is kind of where the gap is, and we're going to focus on this. So where does my opinion come into this? Well, my hypothesis is that high school students are able to create memorable and complex passwords. Now, the reason why I believe this is because most high school students, or currently, high school students are born within the year ranges of 2004 to 2009. Incoming high school students will be born from the year ranges of 2009 and higher. These students have been born into an age of technology, so they have been using technology and creating accounts and passwords for a very long time. Because of this, I believe that high schoolers, at the very least, should be able to create strong and memorable passwords, and if they weren't, just like what Merv Yildirim says, we can instead encourage them to do so. Successfully encourage them to do so. So how can I test this hypothesis? Well, my experiment contains two parts. The first part contains a brute force attack, which I will use to test the security of these admin-generated passwords and student-generated passwords. A brute force attack basically is just a program that quickly punches in a set of numbers, characters, and letters to quickly find out the password. And as for the second part of the experiment, it's going to be a memorability survey sent to the students, asking them to write down the passwords that they created in the first half of the methods and see whether or not they remember them. Now, let's get into more detail about the brute force attack simulation. These will be obtained by giving students the first set of surveys, which will ask them to create a password with guidance. Now, at the end of the survey period, I obtained a total of 19 total responses. So for the admin-generated passwords, I generated 19 of them as well. Now, these admin-generated passwords were generated based on the format at North Michigan High School, because that is our test subject, the place of testing. So, in the password format at North Michigan High School follows a format of having one exclamation point at the beginning of the password along with 8 simple lowercase letters. Now, disclaimer, this is not the actual format at North Michigan High School because because due to legal and privacy reasons. Now, how I chose to measure the data is in time, and this is because not only is time very easy to measure, but it's also because cybercriminals like to value time a lot. If a cybercriminal cannot quickly hack into an account, they'll usually try another method or move on. So, with that being said, passwords taking longer than 1 hour to compromise will instead be labeled with the words "time exceeded." Now, here is the code, 2 sets of code that I used for the student-generated and admin-distributed passwords. Now, you don't have to understand what the code does. You need to understand this is what is used for my experiment. Now, you may have noticed that there's 2 different sets of codes for these student-generated passwords and the admin-generated passwords. And this is because the admin-generated passwords only contained lowercase letters along with a stationary exclamation mark. Meanwhile, the student-generated passwords can contain any number of characters along with letters, numbers, and symbols of any kind, and they weren't limited to what they could add. So 2 different pieces of code were used in order to break the passwords. Now, as for the results of the data, be warned, the data is quite big, so you only need to focus on the middle and right columns of the data, which contains the minutes and seconds in time. So, with that being said, as for the admin-distributed passwords, as you can see, none of them took more than 2 minutes to crack, and only the seconds are different, and with only the biggest amount of time, the largest amount of time that it took to crack passwords being 1 minute and 20 seconds, as shown by the first password that was used. Meanwhile, for the student passwords, all of them exceeded the time frame of 1 hour in order to crack. Now, moving on to memorability surveys, I sent these out to the students again approximately 1 week after the first survey. Now, the students were not informed in the first survey that they will be tested to run the password, and this so that they wouldn't be tempted to write down the passwords anywhere, and it better tests their memory in general. Now, as for the results, at the end of the survey period, I discovered that 16 out of 19 students remembered their passwords. So, now to discuss the data that I presented. So, my hypothesis was right. The students were able to successfully create secure passwords, as shown by the first experiment where all the passwords they created took over 1 hour to crack. Also, my second part of the hypothesis was also correct, that students were able to create memorable passwords because, as for the second part of the methods, the students were 16 out of 19 students were able to successfully remember the passwords created the week prior. Another side note that I found interesting was that the administrative passwords were not very secure, as I originally thought they were. Now, as for the conclusion, so the limitations of the experiment were that the experiment was really only conducted on one high school rather than multiple high schools, so this can't really be applied to like multiple schools because only did on one school, and each school can contain a different password system and different types of password formats, and another limitation was that the 1 week memorability test was probably too short, and that it could be argued that the students probably just had a really good memory. However, there's no way we could possibly test that, so that argument is kind of null. Now, a really big major limitation was that the student passwords used were not the real student passwords at North Michigan High School. Since this is due to legal and privacy reasons, I am unable to test that. So the student passwords currently at North Michigan High School could actually be much more secure than what is presented in the data. As for how can my research be expanded, a researcher can look at my research and decide that cybersecurity experts could decide that school password systems aren't secure, and they could and do their own investigation on their passwords to find out whether or not they are secure. Additionally, instead of finding out whether or not passwords are secure, they can instead look at other vulnerabilities, because if they saw that passwords aren't very secure, they can wonder what other vulnerabilities could exist in school systems. And lastly, one more type of research that can be done is because if they could agree with my hypothesis that student generated passwords should be implemented, they can find their own research on how to implement that in schools. Thank you.
All right. So, first question: how did your review of the methods used by scholars in the field inform your selection of a research method or process that's aligned with your research question or project goal?
So, basically, in cybersecurity, they use what is known as brute force attacks, as I used in my methods, and brute force attacks. And since they also use brute force attacks, I decided to use a brute force attack in my method because I found that to be professional, following the same methods that penetration testers in the cybersecurity fields also use to test security of a system.
How does your new understanding address a gap in the scholarly conversation?
So there was a gap in the scholarly conversation where there were two sides of the argument arguing whether or not that password systems were which password systems were more secure. My new understanding addresses the gap by providing my own solution to this gap and deciding which one is better, which password method was better.
If you could revisit your research process, what would you do differently and why?
So my research process kind of started out as like, I wanted to do password systems, and then I was like, okay, let's instead do like phishing systems, and there was like no ways to like kind of address why I wanted to do password systems, and like phishing systems were like way too broad. So if I were to like go back, I would tell myself to combine them both like much earlier on. Since in my presentation I combined both phishing vulnerabilities and password vulnerabilities at the state under the same justification. However, during the beginning I was unable to do that, and I wasted a lot of time finding out what my research project was.